She stretches her neck and kissed him on the lips. Reciprocating, Nick kissed her back, gradually removing his clothes as he rolled up the blanket. The next morning, ignoring her, he put on his clothes, carried his suitcase and left the house. As he reached for the door, he stopped suddenly, turning his face to Sydney in a cold way. "I want a divorce." Cindy lived with her husband and her 7-year-old daughter Joyce. She was a loving, dedicated mother and wife. She was kind-hearted but resilient in the face of emotional turmoil. She loved her family and placed them above all things. Cindy believed that family was everything. She grew up in a peaceful and loving family herself. She had watched her mother carry the home with grace and patience, so she too had embodied that virtue and cherished it. Her husband, Nick, was a young, handsome man known for his sweet and loving personality. He was kind and very romantic. They had their daughter Joyce 2 years after their wedding and were extremely happy. Joyce was their perfect bundle of joy. She was a kind and beautiful child. She was petite and energetic just like her mother. And she loved food a lot just like her father. Nick was a loving father, and Cindy was a doting mother. Joyce couldn't have asked for more. Their home was always filled with laughter and happiness. Nick and Cindy would play and display their love for each other at every given opportunity. It was a bright Thursday evening. Cindy sat on a couch watching a movie. She kept glancing at the wall clock, looking a little worried. Her beautiful daughter sat at the dining table eating dinner. Soon, there was a knock on the door, and Cindy rushed to open. She let out a delightful cry as her husband Nick entered, carrying a bunch of flowers. She hugged him happily, throwing kisses all over his face. Joyce left her food and ran over to her father, who swept her off her feet, spinning her around as she clung to him tightly, screaming in pleasure. He drew Sydney close to him and kissed her deeply, while Joyce covered her eyes with both hands, leaving Nick and Cindy laughing heartily. Nick and Cindy retired to their room after talking in Joyce. Immediately they stepped foot inside their bedroom. Nick drew Cindy close to his body, kissing her passionately on the lips. "I love you so much," he muttered under his breath. Cindy smiled, grabbing onto him like a magnet. "I love you too, now and forever, and thank you for throwing such a wonderful party," she said, referring to a party he threw 2 days ago for her birthday. "I totally loved it." They clung to each other in a warm hug, both smiling gently. Sydney took off her clothes and entered the bathroom to take her bath while Nick worked on his laptop. She came out minutes later in a sparkling white towel. "Don't you think we should make another mini us?" Nick asked, a smile on his face. Cindy turned to him, smiling as she rolled her eyes. "As if I have not been saying that since. You know Joyce wants a sister, and it's our responsibility to give her that." Nick went over to her and swept her off her feet, taking her to the bed. He placed her gently on the bed, staring into her eyes. "I am so happy you are my wife. You are so beautiful, and you are literally the best thing that happened to me." Cindy smiled, holding onto his face. She stretches her neck and kissed him on the lips. Reciprocating, Nick kissed her back, gradually removing his clothes as he rolled up the blanket. The next morning, Cindy woke up, stretching and yawning. She rolled over to place her hands on Nick as usual, but found the bed empty. She opened her eyes slowly. The bed was empty. She got out of bed, pulling her ropes together. Nick came out of the bathroom covered in a towel. Sydney was surprised because Nick never used a towel to cover his nakedness. She moved over to him and tried to kiss him, but he declined, turning his face in the opposite direction and pushing her away. "I'm late for work. Excuse me," he said, walking away. Shocked, Sydney swallowed hard. Then she moved over to him again, touching him gently. Ignoring her, he put on his clothes, carried his suitcase and left the house. As he reached for the door, he stopped suddenly, turning his face to Sydney in a cold way. "I want a divorce." His face was as hard as a rock. Then he left, slamming the door behind him. Sydney stared at the door, unable to believe her ears. She sat on the same spot for close to 10 minutes, unable to move or say a word. What happened? Just last night, he was all over her, kissing and telling her how much he loved her. And now he wants a divorce? All sorts of thoughts crossed her mind. Could he be joking? Was this a prank? But Nick didn't like pranks. Was he planning something for her and he didn't want her to know? That must be it. She knew it was a prank, and so she brushed it off, stood up and walked out of the room to get ready for her day. She prepared Joy for school, drove her to school and then came back home afterwards. Whenever she remembered the morning event with Nick, her heart skipped. She brought out her phone and tried to call Nick, but she couldn't connect to him. She dropped the phone and stood up. Her heart began to beat faster. What is going on? She thought. Last night was beautiful. What happened? Confused, she sat on the couch, holding her head in pain. Shortly after, Nick entered the house. Sydney ran to him, but he stopped her before she could get to him. He brought out a brown envelope and handed it over to Cindy. "What is this?" she asked, staring him in the eye. "It's the divorce papers. Please sign it and hand them over to me as soon as possible." He finished the sentence and made to leave. "What happened, Nick? What did I do wrong? Can't we talk about it as husband and wife? How can I make up or seek for forgiveness for something I know nothing about?" she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "You have got the nerve to say you don't know what you have done. How dare you? If you know what is good for you, you better sign that paper." Nick snarled, anger written all over his face. Sydney looked at him, not knowing what to say. "What about our daughter?" Nick moved close to her and looked her right in the eye. "That is none of your business. She is my daughter and I can take care of her." He left, entered the bedroom and locked the door behind him. Soon Joyce came back from school. She met her mother crying in the parlor. She ran to her, asking what the problem was, but Sydney claimed she was sick and she was having pains in her stomach. She made lunch for her, then returned to sleep on the couch as she has been locked out of her room. 4 hours later, there was a knock on the door. Sydney went to open. Sandra, Nick's secretary, stood there with a large luggage, smiling happily. Before Sydney could ask her anything, Nick came out of the bedroom, brushed past Sydney and hugged Sandra tightly. He ushered her in, taking her straight to the bedroom. Nick led Sandra into her matrimonial room right in front of her. She felt heat coming out of her head. Her throat became as dry as desert and her legs were trembling. She had to sit down because her legs could no longer carry her. Moments later, Nick came out and instructed her to pack out all her belongings from his room. Sydney refused. She confronted him, asking him what her crime was. Nick, who seemed not to be interested in talking to her, entered the room and started throwing her things out. Joyce came out of her room. She stood by the door, sobbing gently as she watched the drama between her parents. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but Sydney refused to sign the divorce papers. She vowed to protect and save her marriage by all means. Meanwhile, Nick stopped eating her food and no longer gave her money or attention. He displayed affection to Sandra every chance he got in front of Sydney. Sydney had moved her things to the guest room. Life became unbearable and bitter for Sydney. Nick had stopped her from talking or going close to Joyce, and soon Joyce started getting close to Sandra. They were like a perfect little family, and Sydney now looked like a maid in her own house. Her daughter became distant. She didn't want to talk to Sydney or want anything to do with her. This broke Sydney's heart. Her heart was torn apart. She became quiet and depressed. Sydney, once a beautiful woman, was now a shadow of herself. Nick urged her to pack her things and leave, but she refused. Nick made arrangements to leave the country for good. He prepared everything and planned to leave the country in a week, but never told Sydney. Sydney came back from work one afternoon and overheard Nick talking on the phone. She dropped her bag in shock. Nick turned and saw her standing at his back. "Where do you think you're going with my daughter? I have been patient with you, Nick, but not anymore. I will fight you if that is what you want." Nick burst into laughter, interrupting her. "Which daughter are you talking about? Maybe you have a daughter elsewhere because you can't be talking about my Joyce. Because the Joyce I know hates your guts. She doesn't even want to see you for another minute. Can you just leave us alone already? What have you been telling my daughter? What lies have you been feeding my daughter about me?" Sydney asked, breaking down in tears. But Nick ignored her and stormed into his bedroom. Devastated, Sydney burst into tears, dragging herself to her room. All attempts to talk to Joyce proved abortive as she refused to talk to her. Sydney withdrew from everything. She was tired and depressed. Everything she loved had now turned against her. She locked herself up in her room, unable to eat or sleep. 2 days later, Nick was set to leave. He dragged his box out of his room to the sitting room. He called on Joyce to hurry up so they wouldn't miss their flight. Then suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Nick went to answer. He saw their neighbor's wife, Agatha, smiling broadly. She greeted him politely and asked for Sydney. Nick replied that he hadn't seen her for some days, and Agatha was shocked, knowing what a lovely couple they were. "Well," Agatha began, "I hope you guys are okay. If there is anything, you should be able to talk to your wife and resolve it amicably. I almost made the same mistake. I wanted to end my marriage, but I learned at the last minute that my marriage is worth fighting for. I wanted to leave my husband for another man because I didn't feel loved enough. I even persuaded your wife to help me write a letter to my husband." She laughed. Agatha cleared her throat and continued, "My sight is no longer as it used to be, so I needed her help. I didn't even want to say goodbye in person to my husband. I just wanted him to come back and see the letter. But I learned that true love happened once, and my husband loves me, and I love him. I just forgot how to. So I'm here to get the letter and destroy it. Or better still, tell her not to bother if she did not write it at all." You see, Agatha lived with her husband, but lately, she had developed an eye problem. Her sight started getting bad. She couldn't see well, and so her husband had to do everything for her. And soon, he got tired and started to withdraw from her. Agatha felt her husband didn't love her enough, and so she wanted out. But she just found out from her husband's friend that he loved her and was just overwhelmed. After all, he is human as well. Nick stood there like a statue. His face became pale and he started sweating profusely. Suddenly, tears started dropping from his eyes. Agatha moved closer, patting him on the hand. "I saw that letter, and I thought my wife wrote it to me. I thought she was tired of me. I was so hurt and disappointed. I thought she wanted to go away with another man and leave us. I thought she was pretending all along to be happy with me, so I asked her for a divorce. I didn't even ask her or want to talk about it. I just wanted her to confess. Then I brought my secretary home on the pretense that she was my girlfriend, just to spite her. My goodness, I even tried to turn my daughter against her. What have I done? Nick ran to Sydney's room and knocked loudly on the door, but there was no response. Joyce came out of the room with her luggage. Nick glanced at her and asked, "Have you seen your mother?" "I saw her come in earlier. She is in there, I think," she said and went to sit on the couch. Nick continued to knock. After knocking for several minutes without a response, he tried to break down the door. Upon breaking open the door, he saw Sydney lying unconscious on the ground. There were pieces of drugs scattered all over the floor. Nick rushed to her, taking her in his arms. "What have you done, my love?" Nick shouted, tears rolling down his face. Sydney shifted painfully, her eyes swollen, almost closing. Joyce ran into the room. She stopped in her tracks as she saw the state of her mother. She let out a loud and painful cry and ran to hug her. "Mommy, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I love you very much. I only did it because Daddy told me to. I'm sorry, Mommy." Sydney smiled softly, dragging her closer to her body. "I love you too, my little princess, now and forever." Joy stood up all of a sudden. "Mommy needs a doctor. I need to call for help." Then she ran out. Agatha ran after her. Scared, Nick carried Sydney from the room to take her to the hospital. But as he stepped into the sitting room, he heard a loud bang outside. He dropped Sydney and ran outside. Outside, he saw Joyce in a pool of her own blood, dead. A speeding car had hit her and ran off. Nick carried Joyce into the house. Agatha followed, crying loudly. He dropped Joyce gently and went to Sydney. He bent over to carry her, but she too was now dead. Distraught, Nick seemed like he had lost his mind as he cried and wailed. Then he went into his room and came out with a gun. Agatha gasped in shock. Nick pointed the gun to his head. "I did this to myself. I could have simply asked and talked to my wife, but my hurt and ego did not allow me. Now look at the outcome. My once perfect family is in ruins because of me. I even dragged my innocent daughter into it. I can't live with myself. I can't live without them." But before Agatha could say anything, Nick put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Agatha fainted out of shock. She couldn't believe that such a happy family had just perished because of lack of communication. The moral of this story is that we should never assume anything. We should always try to talk to our partners or family about what we feel they've done, just to clarify anything. We should not hold grudges and punish them without talking to them.